What happens when a live television set, polished, rehearsed, and smiling, suddenly forgets how to breathe? What happens when decades of on-air authority collide with calm, unmovable control, and there's nowhere to cut, nowhere to hide because the red light is on and America is watching? This was a weekday morning. Coffee cooling on kitchen counters, TVs humming softly in living rooms. A familiar theme song, familiar faces, another episode of The View until in a matter of minutes it became something else entirely. No warning, no bleep button, no rewind, just silence and then history. Because on this morning, Joy Behar didn't just argue, she stood up and she walked off live. This was supposed to be a normal segment, the kind that fills time between commercial breaks. The kind nobody rewinds. The kind that disappears into the background noise of daily life. The studio lights were already warm, already forgiving, already doing what they were designed to do, smooth everything over. Makeup had been retouched minutes earlier. Microphones clipped neatly in place. Producers had checked their rundown twice. Nothing on the page suggested danger. And yet, something felt off before a single word was spoken. Joy Behar sat exactly where she always did, back straight but relaxed, one arm resting lightly against the table, as if the furniture itself belonged to her. Decades of experience lived in her posture. She knew the rhythm of this room the way sailors know tides. She knew when to speak, when to interrupt, when to land a joke, when to push. This space had rewarded her for confidence for years. It had taught her that certainly reads well on camera. Across from her, Steve Harvey sat differently, not stiff, not casual. Still, his hands were folded loosely, not defensive, not performative. He wasn't scanning the audience or checking the monitors. He was looking at Joy, really looking. The kind of look that doesn't rush you, that doesn't try to dominate, that waits. The kind of look that makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't ask permission. The conversation opened gently. A familiar topic framed safely. One the audience had heard versions of before. People nodded. A few claps came on. Joy spoke first, her voice confident, her tone sharp but polished. Each sentence landed cleanly, the way sentences do when you've delivered them or ones like them hundreds of times. There was an expectation in her cadence, an assumption that the room would follow. Steve listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't smile. He didn't shake his head. He listened the way people do when they're deciding whether something is worth responding to at all. When Joy finished, there was a beat. Not long enough to be awkward, just long enough to be noticed. Steve leaned forward slightly, then stopped himself. He didn't need to move closer to be heard. "I hear what you're saying," he said calmly. "But that's not the whole picture." The words themselves weren't explosive, but the tone was unfamiliar to the room. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't differential. It didn't ask for approval. It simply existed. Joy tilted her head, a half-smile forming, the kind she used when she was about to dismantle a point she'd heard too many times. She replied quickly, almost reflexively, stacking her words with practiced precision. She was still in control, still steering. Steve didn't interrupt again. He waited. That wait stretched just slightly longer than broadcast comfort allows. The kind of pause that makes producers shift in their chairs. The kind of pause that makes an audience wonder if something went wrong. Then Steve spoke again, softer this time. "When you frame it that way," he said, "you leave no room for people who live in the gray." The word gray seemed to hang in the air heavier than it should have. It wasn't provocative. It wasn't dramatic. And yet it landed like a weight placed carefully on the table between them. Joy's fingers tightened around her cards. She didn't look down. She looked straight at him. "Gray is a luxury," she shot back. "Some of us don't get to live there." A few audience members clapped, then stopped when they realized nobody else was clapping with them. The sound died quickly, swallowed by the room. Steve nodded, not in agreement, not in dismissal, just acknowledgement. "And some of us," he said evenly, "are tired of being told where we're allowed to stand." That was when the temperature changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but palpably. The kind of shift people feel in their chest before they can explain it. Joy leaned back slightly, crossing her leg, then uncrossing it. A small movement, unconscious. The kind that happens when someone senses resistance they didn't anticipate. "You're missing the point," she said, her voice firm but controlled. Steve didn't raise his voice. "No," he replied, "I think I finally hit it." The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of listening, but the brittle quiet of uncertainty. The audience didn't laugh, didn't clap, didn't murmur. They waited, unsure what role they were supposed to play now. Joy opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Enough for the cameras to catch it. Enough for the control room to notice. Enough for Steve to notice. She recovered quickly, smiling again, but this smile was thinner. "You don't get to redefine this conversation," she said. "Not here, not here." The words carried more than meaning. They carried territory. Steve leaned back slightly, his hands open now, palms visible. It wasn't a defensive gesture, it was an offering. "I'm not redefining it," he said. "I'm asking why it only ever goes one way." A low murmur rippled through the audience. Not loud enough to interrupt, but loud enough to be felt. A producer leaned toward a headset, whispering instructions that no one on set could hear. Fingers hovered over buttons that might not be pressed in time. Joy shook her head. A quick, sharp movement. "No," she said. "No, no, no, this is exactly what I'm talking about." She laughed, but the laugh didn't travel. It fell flat between them. Steve didn't chase the laugh. He didn't counter it. He waited again. That silence returned thicker this time. When the camera cut closer, instinctively drawn to the tension, Joy's eyes flicked briefly off camera, catching the red light. She knew she was live. She always knew. But this time the awareness didn't steady her. It weighed on her. "You're oversimplifying," she said, and frankly, I'm tired of men coming in here. And Steve lifted one finger, just one. Not high, not sharp, just enough to signal a pause. "Joy," he said quietly. "If you finish that sentence, you're proving my point." Time seemed to stretch. Seconds passed. Too many seconds for daytime television. Too many seconds for a segment that was supposed to wrap cleanly before a commercial. Joy stared at him, her jaw tightened. The authority she'd carried so comfortably now pressed against her, heavy and unyielding. "You don't get to silence me," she said, her voice lower now. Steve met her gaze unblinking. "I'm not silencing you," he replied. "I'm asking you to listen." The word listen landed harder than any accusation could have. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was patient. And patience in that moment felt like pressure. Joy exhaled sharply. She pushed her chair back. The scrape against the studio floor cut through the quiet like a blade. A few gasps escaped the audience before they could stop themselves. A producer's voice crackled urgently in someone's ear. A countdown began that no one on set could hear. Joy stood. The camera followed her instinctively, almost desperately trying to keep up. She didn't look at Steve. She didn't look at the audience. She looked at the table at the place she'd occupied for years. At the familiar surface that suddenly felt foreign. "I'm done," she said. Not loud, not theatrical, just final. She reached for her microphone and unclipped it. The small click echoed louder than it should have. The sound cut off mid-motion, but the message was already delivered. Steve remained seated. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't react. His stillness felt intentional, respectful, devastating. Joy walked off the set live. The camera lingered, unsure whether to follow her or stay behind. Applause started in the audience, reflexive and confused, then died out as quickly as it began. The remaining hosts stared at one another, searching for cues that weren't coming. The red light stayed on. The show continued technically, but something had broken or been revealed. Within minutes, the clip spread. Phones buzzed. Social feeds refreshed endlessly. People rewounded and replayed the pauses, the silences, the body language. They argued over who held the power, who lost control, who crossed the line without raising their voice. Steve said nothing. Joyce said nothing. And the silence that followed became louder than anything that had happened on air. So now the moment lives on frozen and debated, reframed and reinterpreted. A live television exchange that refused to resolve neatly. A reminder that sometimes the most explosive moments don't come from shouting, but from stillness, from tone, from the moment a room realizes it no longer knows who's in control. And the question lingers unanswered, echoing long after the cameras stopped rolling, who was right, who went too far. And when the lights are on and the world is watching who really holds the power, the shift didn't announce itself loudly. It didn't crash through the room. It arrived quietly the way pressure builds before a storm, the way glass flexes just before it cracks. What made it unsettling was that nothing looked wrong at first glance. Everyone was still seated. The lights were still warm. The cameras were still rolling smoothly on their tracks. But control, once effortless, had started to feel heavy, and everyone in the room could sense it. Even if they couldn't name, a Joy's smile stayed in place longer than it should have. It was the kind of smile that exists out of habit rather than feeling, polished by years of live television where reactions must come even when emotions lag behind. Her shoulders were still squared, still confident, but there was a subtle tension now in the way her back pressed against the chair. She had felt rooms turn on her before. She had survived them. This, she told herself, was no different, just another conversation that needed steering. Steve, meanwhile, seemed untouched by the growing unease. He hadn't shifted his posture. His breathing was slow. He didn't look at the cameras or the monitors. He didn't glance toward the producers or the audience. His attention remained exactly where it had been since the conversation tilted off script on Joy. Not confrontational, not aggressive, just present. That presence did more than raised voices ever could. It filled the space between words, making each pause feel deliberate instead of accidental. Joy spoke again. Her tone carefully measured now, as if precision alone could restore balance. Each word was chosen with intention, sharpened to land cleanly. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't flustered. She was asserting. That had always worked before. Authority, when delivered calmly, tends to silence dissent. But this time the effect was different. Instead of retreating, the room leaned in. Steve didn't rush to respond. He let her finish. He always let her finish. That courtesy, repeated again and again, became its own form of pressure. The audience noticed it. You could see it in the way people stopped shifting in their seats, in the way their phones stayed tucked away. They weren't watching a debate anymore. They were watching a balance test. When Steve finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not softer in volume, but softer in force. There was no sharp edge to it, no performative flourish. He wasn't trying to win the room. He was grounding himself in it. "I'm not saying you're wrong," he said. "I'm saying you're not leaving space." Space. Another small word. Another heavy one. Joy's eyes narrowed slightly. She tilted her head again, but this time the movement wasn't playful. It was evaluative. She was recalculating. The rhythm she knew had changed, and she was searching for it. "This isn't about space," she replied. "This is about reality," Steve nodded slowly, as if considering that answer with genuine care. "And whose reality?" he asked. The question wasn't loud, it wasn't accusatory, it wasn't framed as a trap. That's what made it dangerous. It couldn't be brushed aside easily. It required an answer, not a reaction. Joy inhaled. You could see her chest rise. She opened her mouth, then paused just for a beat, long enough for the audience to feel it, long enough for the cameras to catch the hesitation. She answered anyway, her voice steady, confident again, or trying to be. The producer in the control room leaned closer to the monitors. This wasn't the segment they'd planned. This wasn't where the bullet points were supposed to go. Fingers hovered over the commercial cue, but no one wanted to be the one to pull the trigger too early. Cutting away now would only confirm what viewers were starting to sense. Something was happening. Steve listened, and when she finished, he didn't counter with statistics or slogans. He didn't raise his voice or speed up his cadence. He simply said, "That's exactly what I mean." Joy blinked. The audience didn't make a sound. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table now, grounding herself physically as if proximity could reassert control. Her voice sharpened not in volume, but in precision. "You don't get to come in here and tell me how this works." She said, "I've been doing this a long time." The words were meant to establish hierarchy, experience, ownership. Steve didn't dispute it. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm surprised." Surprised? That word landed differently. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't dismissive. It was disappointed. And disappointment has a way of slipping past defenses. Joy's lips pressed together briefly. Her jaw tightened. She straightened in her chair, reclaiming posture, reclaiming presence. She laughed lightly, but the sound felt isolated, unsupported by the room. "This is turning into something it doesn't need to be," she said. Steve met her eyes. "Maybe it already is," he said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken thoughts, full of awareness that the conversation had moved beyond its original purpose. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap, to murmur, to react at all. They had been trained to respond to cues. There were none now. Joy glanced again toward the red light. It burned steadily. A reminder, a witness. She knew what this looked like from the outside. She knew how quickly moments like this could be clipped, framed, replayed. The authority she carried suddenly felt exposed rather than empowering. "You're oversimplifying," she said, her voice tighter now. "And frankly, I'm tired of men coming in here." And Steve lifted his finger. It wasn't abrupt. It wasn't sharp. It was careful, almost apologetic. "Joy," he said quietly, "if you finish that sentence, you're proving my point." Time slowed. The studio seemed to shrink around them. Even the air conditioning felt louder in the pause that followed. Joy stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face. Not at the interruption itself, but at what it represented, a boundary she hadn't expected. A refusal to be steamrolled, delivered without aggression. "You don't get to silence me," she said, her voice low, controlled, but edged now with something raw. Steve didn't flinch. "I'm not silencing you," he replied. I'm asking you to listen. That was the moment something gave way. Not loudly, not explosively, but definitively. Joy exhaled sharply, a breath that carried frustration, fatigue, and something like betrayal. She pushed her chair back. The sound scraped across the floor, jarring in the quiet studio. A few audience members gasped before they could stop themselves. Others leaned forward instinctively as if movement alone could anchor the moment. In the control room, someone whispered urgently into a headset. A countdown began that wouldn't be heard on set. Too late now. Joy stood. Camera followed her, unsure whether this was a dramatic gesture or a fleeting reset. She didn't look at Steve. She didn't look at the audience. Her gaze dropped briefly to the table, to the place that had been hers for so long. The familiar suddenly felt constricting. "Oh, I'm done," she said. No emphasis, no flourish, just finality. She reached for her microphone and unclipped it. The small click echoed louder than it should have, amplified by the silence. The sound cut off, but the message didn't need audio. Everyone had heard it. Steve remained seated. He didn't rise. He didn't gesture. He didn't speak. His stillness was absolute, not victorious, not smug, just present. It felt respectful, and somehow that made it more devastating. Joy walked off the set live. The camera lingered, hesitating between following her departure and staying with the aftermath. Applause began in the audience out of reflex, a conditioned response to movement, to change. It faltered almost immediately, dying in the air as people realized this wasn't a moment meant for clapping. The remaining hosts looked at one another, eyes wide, searching for cues that weren't coming. Someone attempted to speak, then stopped. The red light stayed on, unforgiving. In homes across the country, people leaned closer to their screens. Phones were lifted. Screenshots were taken. Clips were recorded. Within minutes, the moment escaped the studio, spreading faster than any producer could contain. Social media ignited. The pause before the chair scraped back. The raised finger, the word listened. Each fragment dissected, looped, slowed down. Commentators picked sides instantly. Some praised the calm, others condemned the walk-off. Some argued power had finally been challenged. Others insisted it had been disrespected. Steve didn't post. He didn't comment. His silence felt intentional. Joy didn't release a statement, not immediately. Her absence spoke loudly. Producers scrambled to reframe the narrative, issuing careful language about passionate discussion and unexpected moments. But the footage told its own story. A story about control not being wrestled away violently, but questioned quietly, about authority feeling secure until it was asked to listen. The debate didn't die down, it grew. Talk shows replayed the clip. Body language experts weighed in. Viewers argued about tone versus intent, about who crossed a line and who drew one. The moment refused to settle into a clean conclusion. And maybe that was the point. Because what lingered wasn't the walk-off itself, but the stillness that preceded it. The realization that control doesn't always shatter in chaos. Sometimes it slips gently in a room that has forgotten how to breathe. And long after the cameras stopped rolling, the question remained unanswered and uncomfortable. When power is challenged without raising a voice, who really loses control? In the end, there was no verdict. No apology issued on air, no triumphant return, no single moment where the tension dissolved and everyone agreed on what had just happened. The cameras stopped rolling, but the moment didn't end. It followed the audience home. It followed the hosts off set. It followed the conversation into timelines, comment sections, group chats, and late-night debates that refused to settle. What made it linger wasn't the walk-off alone. It was everything that came before it. The pauses that felt too long. The words that sounded calm but carried weight. The realization that control doesn't always announce its exit with chaos. Sometimes it leaves quietly in full view while everyone is still trying to understand what they're watching. Joy Behar didn't storm off in anger. She didn't shout. She didn't throw accusations across the table. She stood up, unclipped her mic, and removed herself from a moment where authority no longer felt absolute. For some, that was strength. For others, it was surrender. The divide was immediate and unforgiving. Steve Harvey didn't raise his voice. He didn't claim victory. He didn't chase her words or her exit. His power came from restraint, from tone, from the refusal to escalate. To his supporters, it was composure under pressure. To his critics, it was provocation disguised as calm. The same silence that looked like dignity to some felt like pressure to others. And that's why the moment refuses to be resolved, because it exposed something larger than two people at a table. It exposed how fragile authority can feel when it's questioned instead of confronted. How unsettling it is when someone refuses to play the role you expect of them. How live television, stripped of scripts and safe endings, becomes a mirror instead of a performance. The studio went quiet that day, but the conversation only got louder. Every replay reopened the debate. Every slowed down clip invited a new interpretation. Was this a boundary being set or one being crossed? Was this a woman refusing to be diminished or a voice unwilling to be challenged? Was this calm strength or calculated control? There was no clean answer then. There isn't one now, and maybe there never will be, because moments like this aren't meant to be wrapped up neatly. They're meant to unsettle, to divide opinion, to force viewers to ask themselves which kind of power they recognize, which kind they trust, and which kind makes them uncomfortable. So the question doesn't end with them. It ends with you. Who do you think held the power in that room? Who do you think lost it? And when silence speaks louder than shouting, which voice do you believe? That's the conversation that continues long after the lights go.